And the title of the scope is actually birthed out of a conversation uh, that I had with someone in whom I know. It was actually birthed out of a conversation that I had with an acquaintance. I'm not so quick to call people friend. It's a term that folk tend to use loosely. Jesus says a friend sticketh closer than a brother. So I'm not too quick, just because we've had lunch together and we've had a couple of laughs together, conversated. I'm not too quick to call anybody friend. But it was an acquaintance of mine, someone in whom I know. And he and I was engaged in this conversation. And of course, the subject matter came up about the church, um, the synagogue. And of course, we understand that rightfully so. We don't go to church. We understand that we go to a building of brick, mortar, and clay, but we are the church. Uh, but for lack of better words, the subject matter came up concerning going to church. And he said to me, he says, "Well, I don't go to church." He says, "Because what I do in this building called church, I can do at my own house." He says, and Herman, let me say something. He said, one of the reasons why I don't go to church, he said, because the church is one of the most hypocritical places on earth that I know. I said, well, expound further. What do you mean? What do you mean the church is one of the most hypocritical institutions, or one of the most hypocritical places on earth that you know? He said, because in the church resides some of the most unloving and unforgiving people I have ever seen in my life. He said, it's not that I have not been to church. He says, I've been to church. I've been to church. It's not that I haven't been. Hey, Pastor Pitts, good to see you. He says, it's not that I haven't been. He says, I've been to church. He says, but I've discovered that in the church, you have more hateful people in the church than you have in the world. You have more unforgiving people in the church than what you have in the world. And let me say this, I can't stretch it that far. You understand what I'm saying? Realistically so. Because I'm a realistic kind of man, or let me say this, I try to be a realistic kind of man. I attempt to be a realistic kind of man. And I can't stretch it that far, because to stretch it that far would be a half truth. And a half truth equals a whole lie. Are you with me? I can't stretch it that far as to say that there are more hypocritical people in the church than there are in the world. And there are more unloving people in the church than they are in the world. I can't stretch it that far, because I would be telling a half truth, and a half truth equals to nothing than a whole lie. But I can say this: he's close. He's close. And it's amazing. It's amazing how many unforgiving people that we have in the house of God. How many people who say that they love God, but yet we cannot love one another? First John chapter 4, right about verse 20 says this. Can somebody type that on the screen for me, please? First John chapter 4, verse 20. First John chapter 4, right about verse 20 says this. It says, how can you love God, someone in whom you have never seen, but yet walk around hating your brother, someone in whom you've seen every day? Think about that. Think about that. You don't have to rebuttal that. You don't have to expound upon that. You don't have to answer that. But I want you to think about that. First John 4 and 20. How can you love God, someone in whom you have never seen, but yet hate your brethren in whom you see every day? How can we walk around talking about how much we love God, screaming and hollering in the church, spitting all up on the floors, laying prostrate on the floor, and then after we speak in tongues, we can't even leave the house of God and speak to one another? Y'all ain't saying nothing, y'all. Hmm? How can you speak in tongues, but yet can't speak to one another? Shame on you and all your houses. If you can walk around here speaking in tongues, but can't speak to one another, shame on you in all your houses. If you could walk around here having all this love for God, but yet can't love one another. And in First John chapter 4, verse 20, when the word of God says, how can you love God, someone in whom you've never seen, and yet hate your brethren in whom you've seen every day? Some of you all still haven't gotten that revelation. Because here's the revelation, here's the revelatory truth of First John chapter 4, right about verse 20. What God is really saying is that it is utterly impossible to love me, someone in whom you've never seen, but yet hate your brethren in whom you've seen every day. It's what God is really saying, and you've never gotten that revelation. You've never got, but what God is saying when He says in First John 4 and 20, how can you love me, someone in whom you've never seen, but yet hate your brethren in whom you've seen every day? What God is really saying is it is impossible for you to love whom you've never seen, but yet hate who you see every day. Here's what God is saying. Can I stretch it a little bit more? Let me stretch it a little bit more. Let me bring it to where you are. Let me bring it to where you are. I'm about to walk down your street, knock on your door, sit right in your living room on your sofa. Here is what God is saying. How can you love someone that you don't even know exist apart from what you've been taught and what you believe? Here's a question for you. How many of you that are under the sound of my voice, how many of you in whom are listening to me have physically and technically seen God? How many of you under the sound of my voice, how many of you that are listening to me have physically and technically put your arms around God? Absolutely none of you. God says, how can you love someone in whom you don't even know that exist apart from what you believe? How do we know God exists? We know God exists by what we believe. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. We know that He exists by what we believe. We know that He exists by what we've been taught. But no one under the sound of my voice have physically laid their hands on God. God says it is utterly impossible for you to love someone in whom you have never physically seen, but yet hate the one in whom you physically see every day. Stop walking around talking about all this love that you have for God, and yet you're walking around hating folk, walking around can't even forgive folk. First John chapter 4, right about verse 8. Watch this now. It says this. First John 4 and 8. Can someone type that on the screen for me? And I'm out of here in about 2 minutes. I'm gone. First John chapter 4, right about verse 8 says this. It says, he that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. I'm going to drop this on you like it's hot and I'm out of here. It says, he that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. For those of you who are walking around talking about how saved you are and how filled with the Holy Ghost you are, but yet you're walking around here hating folk, speaking in tongues but can't speak to one another. For those of you that you're walking around here hating folk, talking about how much you love God, God says, let me give you some revelation. He says, one of the reasons why you find it difficult to love people is because you don't know me. He that loveth not knoweth not God, because God is love. One of the reasons why you're walking around, God says, with so much hatred in your heart, 1 minute and I'm out of here. One of the reasons why you're walking around with so much hatred in your heart is because you do not know me. Now watch this now. When First John chapter 4, right about verse 8, talks about knowing God, it's not talking about having been introduced to God. But when it says, he that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love, when it uses the word know in that particular context, God says, I want you to have an understanding that I'm not saying that you haven't been introduced to me. He says, but what I am saying is that you haven't been intimate with me. The word know in that particular text, First John chapter 4, right about verse 8, the word know in that particular text comes from the Greek word gnosko, which simply means by way of personal experience, and it speaks in reference to intimacy. God says it is difficult for you to have been intimate with me and yet walk around hating folk. Because watch this now. When you become intimate with God, you become at one with God, which means you walk in the heart and the love of God. Some of you all haven't become at one with God. Some of you all ain't walking with God because many of you all have not been intimate with God. You know him by way of introduction. You just don't know him by way of intimacy because you ain't spending no time with him. God says it's difficult to know me. My God, I feel glory now. It's difficult for you to know me, for you to be intimate with me, but yet walk around here hating folk and not forgiving folk. But listen, my mother, but listen, in the church shouting as loud as a Bessie bug. My mother used to always say, watch loud folk in church because empty wagons will make the most noise. Some of y'all shouting loud because you ain't got no substance. I'm out of here. Bye.